Oh, no, I mean, I'm gonna introduce.
Taking the beach. Yeah. Yeah. With Al Hughes, is that who the other one was? I think so. I know there's two of us.
Yeah,
I think it's Al
Yeah.
Hughes.
Okay,
In
cool.
Des Moines, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Didn't know who it was.
You can connect now.
Yeah, I thought there was a. Like, I was gonna like try to like check in and
Yeah.
figure it out, but all right, yeah. So I will probably be close here. Though. They said I can do it.
Yeah, Alex says the most there, but he says he's probably gonna win.
He's probably. Yeah.
And you family here, so
And so was, yeah. Like in here, you know, I
I
got
know.
like 5
I
family,
know.
so I wouldn't even have gone. I had to go. Yeah, so.
Yes. Really nice chair.
Oh, big right.
Damn. I was gonna go like. grab a box. So, do you mind if we go?
Oh.
You're on my.
Asian drinkers, they do like active litigation, yeah, find out stuff, so. Maybe. Hey, dude.
Good view.
I'm better with it. Fine, master, I did a lot. Agricultural economics. So a lot of emphasis on like water conservation, chemical runoff. Especially these mega. Hey, dude. John's working at the environment.
Good, yeah. Very good. West. I heard there's a second person. And I was had like investigated again. He just told me a few.
I went and like,
Sorry, that sounds familiar.
like still hike the nose. Like, really pulled up, and I- they already walked.
This kind of, I can really. I called it a butt.
Hey, how are you?
Now, found it.
I thought it was one of those, I thought it was Baker, and then the partner said, "What's Baker?" He's like, "Bakery." I'm like, that's so Texas.
Where's that?
So.
It reminds me. Did you like do the dam? Oh, the top of it.
I would have been here.
Like the dam, there are like.
Come in there for a while.
You should do that. If you walk down, you're like in the dam. Yeah.
And what? Like, oh, the office. But anyway, like during my interview, like, one of them was there, I did that.
After graduating, summer after graduating high school, my buddy.
If you're there, you like, right, be there, but.
Yeah, no, I'm from Des Moines, so I was just gonna help.
Like
Either way,
but it was like kind of
I just
my
couldn't.
yeah, class across here.
Now,
My plan is.
Look, there's room, there's a, yeah, there's not over here.
Get lucky in town.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I had like, some of them, I don't know what anyone put this.
That way,
I'm giving it a task.
Hey, Brian, just hotel, where we go down to Ocean City.
Right. So
And
half my summer can be.
Is that working?
Yeah, well, there's two, there's one in New Jersey, there's one in Maryland. One city, Maryland is where your parents go, and New Jersey is where-
All you care about.
Just the cable pretty well.
You're on.
Yeah. Hello, Chairman. Where's the building located?
All was. You see. Think shrine. But it's on that bed, but it might go honestly. But it's on the bed.
Oh.
And it's sort of right next to it. A bunch of stuff.
Okay, cool.
Stuff like that. Are not like something.
Maybe, yeah.
Whatever you want.
It's like, it's basically going in there. Maybe last summer.
I'm like, well, that's a dress up. Here I am. Yeah, remain.
All right, welcome, everybody. Can you hear me online?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. If at any time you cannot, please let us know, right? We have these microphones. I hope they pick everybody up. I'm going to just kick things off with introductions. I'm thrilled at the turnout today. A couple new faces. I know many of you, but for those whom I've not met, I'm Shannon Raisler, a faculty member here at the law school and the faculty director of the Hubbell Environmental Law Initiative. I want to thank Blake Group for putting this together, our program director. She's fantastic. We're so lucky to have her. And, you know, she makes all of this happen. Food just shows up. It's wonderful. So thanks for joining us today. Thank you so much to our distinguished visitors who are going to talk about their careers in environmental law. I will introduce them in a moment. I'm going to ask them to maybe speak for 5 minutes or so, right? Just give us some teasers. And then I want you guys to ask questions, right? So I really want this to be discussion based so that you get a chance to have a conversation. So far, the technology seems to be working, just fantastic. All right, so I'm going to start with the one person who's present in the room. It's my pleasure to introduce Ingrid Bronstal. She just joined Healy as our first research fellow in January of this year. She's a 2011 Iowa law grad, has worked primarily in environmental law and policy in Iowa since graduation. Most recently, she served as the water program director at the Iowa Environmental Council, working on legislative, legal, and administrative fronts to improve and protect water quality in Iowa. Ingrid also worked for the University of Iowa as an environmental compliance specialist with utilities and energy management. That has turned out to be a very useful experience as we work with on campus issues, ensuring that university operations followed state and federal environmental regulations. So she's agreed to go first, but I'm going to introduce everybody right now and then maybe go in the order of your introductions, which are totally random. Eric Durth, online here, is an assistant attorney general in the environmental division of the Iowa Attorney General's office. He is legal counsel for Iowa's Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa's Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and the Iowa State Fair. He litigates environmental enforcement actions against solid waste, air quality, and water quality violators. He also earned an MA in environmental advocacy in 2015 and graduated from Iowa Law in 2018. So thank you for being here today. John Land is a shareholder at the Dickinson Law Firm in Des Moines. John has represented clients with various environmental issues, including the Des Moines Waterworks and litigation over agricultural pollution and the Raccoon River. Many of you may have read about that very critical litigation in the news. So maybe we'll hear more about that. And last but not least, Robert Andy Anderson, a native of Council Bluffs, Iowa, a member of the Iowa Law School Foundation, received both his BS and JD degrees here at Iowa, was an articles editor for the Iowa Law Review, a fellow and MPA graduate of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government in 1986. He taught graduate environmental and energy management courses as a professional lecturer at George Washington University. He spent the majority of his very distinguished career with the federal government at EPA as Deputy General Counsel at the National Science Foundation, as the first General Counsel for the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, and as Chief Counsel of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. At NSF, he served as Senior U.S. Representative in Antarctica, which is really interesting to hear about, and designed a cradle-to-grave waste management pollution control program for the United States based on the continent, among many other things. But I will stop here so we can get to the good stuff, and we will start with
Great. Thanks, Shannon, and thanks for everyone on the panel, especially John Landy is a classmate of mine, so it's good to see you again, John. I think Shannon went through most of my bio, but it's really exciting to be back here at Iowa Law with this environmental law initiative. I know I was interested in environmental law when I came here, and I'm honestly pretty jealous of this initiative starting up and the additional opportunities for students that it's providing. So I'm definitely excited to be here. I went to Iowa for undergrad, took a few years off, worked for a zoo, worked for a research facility, did a couple of other things, and then came back and went to law school. And then worked on the industry side, you could say, working for the university to make sure we were in compliance. That was a really interesting job, and I think helped a lot once I moved to the advocacy side, understanding, how regulated entities respond to, regulatory proposals, how the agencies like the DNR work with both sides of, regulated industries and the advocacy groups. I think that was really helpful experience for me to have had. And it's nice working for an institution like the University of Iowa that wants to do the right thing. So there were a lot of opportunities. I got to work on some renewable energy projects, some other environmental management projects that the university was kind of playing with. And the university was an interesting organization to represent because a lot of what my job was to figure out what regulations applied, because the university doesn't really fit very well in boxes. You have a power plant, you have residence halls, you have labs, you have, there's not a clear fence line like you would have in a lot of other industries. So a lot of it was figuring out, what does actually apply. And it's interesting when you work in that kind of space and somebody from design and construction or the power plant would say, well, what do we have to do? And it's like, well, it's not actually, you'd think it'd be clear, but it's not. So there's a lot of, working with people to figure out what makes sense and how to actually comply. And then with Iowa Environmental Council, that position was a lot more working specifically on water quality and advocating for cleaner water across the state. We did a lot of work up at the legislature, talking with legislators, seeing what policies we could move forward. We didn't file a lawsuit while I was there, but that was something we always were kind of keeping track of, what opportunities are there to file litigation in the state, following up from things like the Waterworks lawsuit. So that's a brief kind of rundown of my experience. And yeah, I'll turn it over to some of the other presenters.
Are you okay going next?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I guess I would just echo a lot of the sentiments that were just shared about this initiative. I think it's wonderful that the University of Iowa College of Law is providing it, and I am certainly envious that I didn't have the opportunity to sit in one of those seats and listen to some legal advocates tell their stories about how they ended where they did. I think it's a great initiative, and I look forward to continuing to engage with all of you and hopefully see you all to go on to have successful environmental careers. So for my work, I actually, I'm an assistant attorney general, as was shared, in the environmental law division. It's a very small division in our attorney general's office, but there's 3 of us, but I like to think that we're a mighty force. We provide general counsel to the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Agricultural and Land Stewardship. And in practice, what this means often is that I'm both on the affirmative litigation front and on defensive litigation, just as the nature of being in a governmental office. There's going to be people, say, from Iowa Environmental Council who might not be happy with the Department of Natural Resources, but then people such as like the Farm Bureau who would be very displeased if DNR did something else. So we end up kind of having to straddle that line. And in my time at the AG's office, we've been involved with several good affirmative litigation, or I would say pro-environmental litigation, and then also on the defensive front. So we kind of have to strike a balance. And ultimately, it's not my call, it's our clients, it's the Department of Natural Resources, and we're there to provide the legal service. So that's fundamentally what I would say, kind of the 1,000-foot or 10,000-foot view. One of the most fun parts of my job, I'll share the kind of the two interesting aspects. I think the one is there's very few positions in Iowa where you actually get to take environmental enforcement actions through trial. So this would be someone who violates an air quality, water quality, or solid waste disposal law. It goes through DNR, and if it exceeds a certain threshold of the severity of the violation, it gets referred to my office. It gets referred to the Attorney General's office. So then we take the case and then we prosecute them civilly. So for example, in 2020, there was a company that had collected 30,000 railroad ties on a property and then couldn't figure out how to dispose of them. So then they lit them on fire, and then it proceeded to burn for 3 days. And so that would be an egregious action that gets referred to our office. And then so it comes to me to take that case. And so that's just kind of an example of the exciting litigation work that I get to do. And then I would say more on the transactional side, some of the interesting work that I am fortunate to do with Department of Agriculture and the state soil and water conservation districts is a lot on water quality and soil conservation practices. So I'm involved in their property related work when it comes to easement acquisition, enforcement of easement rights. Oftentimes landowners will get easements through some type of a grant or cost share program, but then after several years, they decide they want to tear up the practice, then resume farming, or there's sediment damage, soil erosion, something that's causing harm that they're not taking the steps that they're supposed to take. So then I both help with the drafting and then also with the enforcement of those terms to make sure that they're complying with whatever they've agreed to at the beginning. And just because I think it's fascinating, because I represent them, the state actually has 100 soil water conservation districts, one for every county in the state of Iowa, with the exception of Potawatomi County, where there's 2. And basically these were created in the 1930s, 1940s to address sediment loss and soil damage that was being caused through wind events and severe weather related events. They're different from drainage districts, but they actually are elected. They're voted on every 2 years. And so Johnson County has a soil water conservation district with 5 commissioners who are chiefly responsible for going out and investigating erosion and complaints of erosion, which is a really interesting and important part of Iowa's agricultural landscape. And it's something that I always think is a great tool when people are wanting to talk about water quality. I always direct them to talk to their local conservation district commissioners, because they have some tools that I think are often overlooked in this larger landscape. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Am I saying, John, Mr. Land, is it Land or Landy?
Landy.
Landy, so I apologize.
That's okay.
I'm wrong, Mr. Landy. Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as Ingrid mentioned, I graduated in 2011. I've been at the Dickinson Law Firm here in Des Moines since I graduated. So our firm is a general service civil firm. We handle everything from transactional work to pretty much any kind of non-criminal litigation that you might have. This firm historically has represented the Des Moines Water Works, which is the largest water utility in the state. It serves most of the Des Moines metro area, about 500,000 to 600,000 customers, which is kind of what led to my involvement in the clean water case. But a little bit more about my practice. I do some environmental work related to representation of the utility, as well as some other utilities that our firm represents. Beyond that, I have kind of a general commercial litigation practice, and I also do a lot of work for financial institutions. One of the things that's I think interesting about Iowa, and particularly practicing in Des Moines, is the variety of substantive areas you find yourself working in. I had an interest in undergrad. I was an environmental policy major, but in law school, I had more of a general litigation kind of focus, and ended up working here in Des Moines, and then found my way back to environmental law. And probably the most significant experience I've had is when Des Moines Waterworks decided to file suit against a handful of drainage districts, which are located in Northwest Iowa. Drainage districts are a truly unique legal entity under state law. They are creatures of statute, and they only have powers provided to them by statute. And that has, for over 100 years now, served as a legal basis for the Iowa Supreme Court to say that drainage districts don't have, you can't be sued because their authorities are so strictly limited. The Iowa Supreme Court has said that since they can't do anything to solve a variety of problems that they've been sued for over the years, they have effective immunity against suit. And just to give you a sense of some of the things that they've managed to evade over the years, drainage district had a retention pond that was created as a result of some of their drainage infrastructure, that people would go out on little boats and fish. And unfortunately, somebody fell off the boat and got sucked under into one of the culverts draining the pond and died. And the drainage district was not responsible for that because they had no power under the Iowa Code to do anything to prevent somebody from dying. So, you look at that landscape, and the one exception that had historically existed for drainage districts was they did have to comply with law, which makes sense. They had to comply with other state laws that might impact them. So for example, there's state laws governing benefits that are given to employees. That was something they had to comply with. So the theory was, well, there's a Federal Clean Water Act. Drainage districts ought to have to comply with that because they are, point sources, or at least we thought they were, within the meaning of the statute. And there is an exception in the Clean Water Act for agricultural stormwater discharge, but nobody knows what that means because it's never really been interpreted, and it's not a scientific term. It's sort of a consequence of a compromise that was made in Congress in order to get the Clean Water Act passed. So that was kind of the substantive issue that we thought we were going to fight about, but we ended up not spending very much time at all in court, at least, arguing about the science of how drainage districts facilitated the transfer of nutrient pollution from farm fields in Northwest Iowa to the Raccoon River and ultimately to the intakes at the Des Moines Waterworks. We spent most of our time talking about arcane legal doctrines related to whether or not the Des Moines Waterworks was the proper party or had standing effectively to challenge the drainage district's activity. And, it was kind of a unique procedural path that the case followed because we filed in federal court in Northwest Iowa. But because our claims depended in part on a state law immunity that the drainage districts had historically enjoyed, we actually had the case certified to the Iowa Supreme Court. There's a procedure for a federal district court to certify state law questions to the Iowa Supreme Court. The Iowa Supreme Court took that, and we spent a year in the Iowa Supreme Court arguing about whether or not Des Moines Waterworks, as one political subdivision of the state of Iowa, could sue another political subdivision of the state of Iowa that happened to also be a drainage district. So, I think it really highlights, the experience of an environmental attorney. You can find yourself having very little to do with actual environmental law issues, or I should say environmental, the substance of the environmental problem, and spend a lot of your time dealing with, just general principles of jurisdiction and sovereign immunity and things of that nature. So, I think for the aspiring litigant, environmental litigant, I think a strong background in federal courts, civil procedure, and administrative law are absolutely critical to that career path. And oftentimes that background will have nothing whatsoever to do with the interesting stuff that involves putting on hip waders and going out and getting wet and dirty and looking at the science. So.
Thank you, Mr. Laney. That was wonderful. It's wonderful. I mean, I have a million questions, but I'm gonna ask them someday. I know. The lawsuit is just fascinating, and thank you for sharing that detail with us. Okay, last but not least, Mr. Anderson.
Yes, good afternoon. Sitting here after practicing for 46 years, I want you to know I can still remember very distinctly what it was like to be in your position and looking for your first job. So rather than trying to summarize a 46-year or 47-year now career in environmental law, I'm going to go through and just pick out a few highlights with a few tips that you might want to take with you. And I'll start right from the beginning. I knew right away, I'd worked as an environmental planner in Omaha at an SMSA, and I knew that I wanted to do environmental law when I went to law school. So by the time I was looking for my first job, my dream job was either with the Land and Natural Resources Division of Justice or with EPA in Washington, D.C. Well, there's a lot of things that can happen when you're pursuing your dream. Watergate intervened, of all things. Ford froze all hiring, and there were 350 of us law students out there without a job. So I had to go to private practice right from the beginning. I went to a large law firm, Squire Sanders and Dempsey, worked as an associate for 2 years and kept open to the possibilities, and finally landed a job not in Washington, D.C., but with EPA in Chicago and Region 5, and worked my way up to deputy regional counsel, involved in all sorts of litigation. The good thing about working for EPA is 90% of what you do is about environmental law. And so it's a good place to start. The other good thing about it is the federal government does not have the luxury to wait and train you the way a large law firm can. And so very quickly, you'll be involved in some very important issues, as I was during my 6-year career at EPA. I left EPA because of Ann Gorsuch. Maybe you don't know who Ann Gorsuch is, but she was the anti-environmental EPA administrator in 1986 under the Reagan administration. And so I got disgusted and said, what do I need? What are my skill sets that I need to improve on? And basically I thought management, working with people, leadership. So I left EPA with the agreement that I'd return to the federal government and took a sabbatical at Harvard and got a degree there. And lo and behold, another twist and turn, somebody who I didn't think liked me very much said, hey, Andy, there's a job down on the career board, I think, with your resume written in mine. It's at the National Science Foundation. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like environmental. But I went down and looked at it anyway. And it turned out they needed a deputy regional counsel with environmental experience because they were having trouble in Antarctica with Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and all those environmental groups. And so I applied for the job, and lo and behold, I got it and moved to Washington, D.C. 2 points I want to make about those first two little trips in my journey. Be open to opportunities. Things aren't going to be perfect. If you're looking for the perfect law, it's not going to be there. Especially that first job, I can assure you it's not going to be there. But be open to the opportunities. And I think that in a way, my career was more like it is now for the younger people going out, in that I left a lot of different positions, or maybe I was asked to leave, I don't know, but left a lot of positions and always enjoyed the next step. Well, at NSF, I did. I spent a lot of time in Antarctica, even got to serve as the only attorney that's ever served as U.S. representative in Antarctica, and designed a cradle-to-grave waste management and pollution control program that we got President Bush 1 to fund for $30 million and implement on the ice. So that's probably the highlight of my whole career. After that, I was offered a job as the first general counsel of a brand new agency called the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, cleaning up DOE's nuclear messes around the world, or around the United States at least. And finally, my last stop in a federal career was with the Corps of Engineers as their sixth chief counsel. And obviously, there aren't many common themes to all those jobs, except they're all had environmental protection at the heart of those jobs, and clean water was always an issue. I was able to litigate. I was able to advise at the highest levels, all the way up to the president in a couple of cases on issues. And I owe it all to Iowa. That's why I'm so much in favor of this initiative as well. I did leave the federal government during the second Bush administration for personal reasons, and went to private practice. One of those personal reasons was my wife, who said it was time to make some money for the family. So I went to a large law firm and worked there a little bit, and then I got a chance to start an environmental group at two other law firms and continued that. And I'm listed, I think, as a consultant. That's sort of a euphemism. Now I get to do whatever I want to for whomever I want to, and I can say no to anybody. But the one thing that I'd suggest to you as you're looking for a job, there are a couple of things. If you're looking for money, and many people have debts, go to private practice is probably the place you want to go. If you're looking for public service, there's no better place than the federal government. Every federal agency, and some are dedicated to environmental issues like the National Park Service, EPA, the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, DOE's Waste Management Division, and it goes on. And they do practice a lot of environmental law, and Department of Justice. If you get a chance to go with them, especially in DC, you would do a lot of litigation, and it would be focused on environmental issues. U.S. Attorney's Office, if they're one of the districts that has a lot of environmental business and they're looking for somebody to fill a gap, that's a great place to start as well. If you have the good fortune of being offered more than one job, I can tell you one of the features that you should look at very carefully, and that's who you're going to be supervised by directly. Almost all the research you hear in human resources is pick a first line supervisor that will be a mentor, that will see that you get opportunities to advance. And I can't emphasize how important that's been. And I've been very lucky to have had great first line supervisors, some by design, some just by luck because I wanted the job, but I was very lucky in that regard. And so I'll leave the rest of it up for questions. I think I've used up my time, Shannon. So I wish you all the best of luck. And if you don't get your question in, or you don't have any questions, but you're thinking about federal or large law firm practice, feel free to email me, not at this email, but at rob70andy@icloud.com. And Shannon or Blake can give you that after we're done. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Well, I mean, there is so much wonderful experience in this room, virtually and literally, right? So this is your opportunity to ask the burning questions, right? I really want to open it up to a dialogue. So is there a question to get us started? Or all or one, you can. Wait, you have to be comfortable with silence. It's one of the things I've learned in my years of teaching. It will happen. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is, so at least 3 of the 4 of you are currently working in like the Midwest, or in Iowa, I guess. And it sounds like, from what I'm hearing from you guys and just sort of across the board, that there's not like a ton of opportunities for law students and people right out of law school to work in environmental law in Iowa and in the near areas. And so I'm wondering if like, this is sort of speculative, but if you think that will be like changing as the field is growing, and then also if you have any recommendations for how like you kind of got in like into the field, even though it's not sort of a giant field in Iowa. That's for anyone.
Yeah, maybe, can we start on live? Maybe Mr. Landy or Mr. Durs, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends a little bit on what you consider to be an environmental lawyer. I think the Farm Bureau hires a lot of environmental lawyers or has some, but if that's not the side of the issue you're looking to be on, then as in terms of environmental advocacy positions, I'd be interested to hear from Ingrid, because I think you've had more of the direct path, into that area. I would say, the path that I followed was sort of taking a job that was available to me and figuring out within that practice and the freedom that I have in private practice to kind of identify areas that I wanted to grow into. And I was fortunate that the firm had an opportunity come along that made that easy. But I think in private practice in Iowa, you do have quite a bit of flexibility to develop a practice area that's of interest to you. But I'd be interested in Ingrid's thoughts on that too.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's funny that you say direct path, because I don't feel like my path has been super, super direct, but I do think, or at least advice that I got coming out of law school was, talk to people. I mean, I got most of my positions that I ended up in through networking or through just, and I'm a pretty introverted person, but I managed to, just look up some people and have, networking meetings. Hey, would you have a coffee with me and talk to you about your background, your path, that sort of thing. I do think it's hard to know. I was in the same boat where I was like, well, I want to do environmental law, but like law and policy, but what does that mean? What does that look like? What are the options in these areas? And so it is really helpful to have opportunities like this to talk to people who are working in those fields, or just like do some research on your own and say, hey, this person is doing something interesting, and have a coffee with them or a Zoom with them. And people are usually pretty willing to talk about what they do and how they got there. And I think that was really helpful for me to come up with a landscape of what the different possibilities were. And I've never been an environmental litigator, but I've always been, sort of policy adjacent or compliance adjacent, that sort of thing. And those were not necessarily opportunities that I knew about when I was in law school. And I think the previous professor who taught environmental law, Professor Stensvag, told me one time, there are opportunities like John said, there are opportunities to represent organizations on the defensive side. It depends how you feel about that, or what they're going to be asking you to do. But I do think there is some value in being in those organizations and being a person who's like, okay, we actually need to do this right, and we need to, you could go work for a Cargill or an ADM or something and say, hey, we actually need to comply with these, and that's a very important role to keep industry in complying and make sure they're doing what they're required to do. So I think there is a lot of different opportunity. I would say on the advocacy side, that was definitely something, the opportunity through with environmental counsel came through also networking and just knowing professionals in the area for several years. So I think sometimes those advocacy opportunities, they're probably not going to pick you up right out of law school. They want somebody who has some experience, and nonprofits especially don't have a lot of resources or time to train you. So that's something I know Josh Mandelbaum, who works for Environmental Law and Policy Center, he did private practice litigation for a few years and then went to ELPC. So he already knew he knew basically, like John was saying, the ins and outs of litigation, and then jumped over to environmental, advocacy defense work. So.
Gareth, do you want to maybe talk about the government path here?
Yeah, sure. I actually got this job. So my path, I grew up in Iowa, and I don't know out of curiosity, how many of you in the room grew up in Iowa or originally from Iowa? Okay, so a fair amount. And even our panelists. So I grew up in Iowa, and when I was a senior in high school, I wanted to get out of the state. I wanted to leave. That was my goal. I didn't want to be in Iowa. It was cold in the winter. It wasn't near a beach. Did not sound like fun to stay for my career. So I went to school in Florida for undergrad, and then got continued to cultivate a passion for environmental work. And so I went up to Virginia for my master's program, because as I think we've heard, DC is a great place to be. And so I kind of pictured my path to go to DC to do that environmental advocacy work. But while I was in that master's program, it was kind of in the Appalachia area. So it's Shenandoah Valley was where my master's program was. And I saw we're very much involved with mountaintop removal, trying to stop mountaintop removal. And I realized over the course of that advocacy work, oftentimes people would just say, well, this is when the lawyers step in. This is when we just turn it over to the lawyers, or the lawyers say we can't do this. And that just drove me crazy. And so it's like, well, then then let's become lawyers. That seems like that's the easiest solution to fix this problem. So then I started to look at law schools, and that's when I had the realizations like, well, do I want to go back to Iowa and practice environmental law, knowing that there might not be that same level of environmental law opportunity as staying in like DC? And that was a tough decision, but ultimately I was close to my family, and being away for 6 years made me miss the state. And so I came back fully intending to practice environmental law, at least in Iowa, or at least in the region. And so I don't know how many of you started law school with a passion or determination to practice environmental law, but that's how I entered in year one at Iowa Law. And so from day one, it's what courses could I take, even if it's not called environmental law, whether it's property 1, property 2, just whatever type of torts, like you can always find an angle to make something environmental law. And so just working through that program, I was fortunate enough to get a internship or an externship with the Attorney General's office with Tom Miller, who was the AG at that time, who did a lot for multi-state litigation, was involved in these cross-state litigation, whether against other states, whether against the federal government. And so I kind of got a foot in the door at the Iowa Attorney General's office through an externship that when my predecessor retired, I was able to start. So they contacted me and said, he's retiring, would you like to start? And so I was fortunate enough to start right out of law school at the Attorney General's office. So I know that's kind of a long-winded path, but I think it's helpful in clarifying that externships are always useful, even if they say they're not hiring. Talking to Josh Mandelbaum and saying, hey, can I extern for the ELPC? Talking with Iowa Environmental Council, talking with Sierra Club. If you're interested in that pro-environmental advocacy work, don't let the fact that they might not be hiring right now dissuade you from taking the step. And then government. I know state government might not be the most sexy or most exciting opportunity on its face, but I believe, and Ingrid might know better than me, I think the current counsel for Iowa Environmental Council was in a regulatory agency in Minnesota before taking this position. A lot of DNR's in-house attorneys have left to go elsewhere, and that's how you move up to EPA, or you move up to DOJ, or you move up to the state attorney general's office. So getting your foot in the door and not being disgruntled if it's not the perfect opportunity is really a great opportunity, or a great strategy for continuing to pursue that environmental career. And so I would say Iowa does have very few pure environmental law positions, but I think I also could reframe that to say there's a whole lot of opportunity here for environmental positions, because there's not a huge supply. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. And with Chicago having an EPA, that's region 4, is that what you said? I think region 5. And then I know Kansas City, I think, is region 7. And so you're covering the Midwest. And so those are both Midwest hotspots. And Minnesota has a whole lot of regulatory work if you want to start in state government. So there's tons of opportunity. It just might not be Greenpeace or some of those, and like a national, I don't think Sierra Club has a general counsel, or if they do, I think it's just he just works at a law firm. It's just a client of his, but they don't have in-house in Iowa. So you might not get the big names, but there's definitely opportunity. Just don't let the fact that it might be a little bit harder dissuade you from trying to find those positions.
Mr. Anderson, do you have anything to add? You've been nodding, so I just want to give you a chance.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said about Iowa, and of course, if you go to the Kansas City regional office of the EPA, you're going to have Iowa cases. But I would say that if you want to work in a pure environmental environment, EPA is a great place to start, or the Department of Justice if you can get into the program. They're very selective. And the U.S. Attorney's Office is in certain locations, and you'll know when you take an interview with the U.S. Attorney's Office, if you're interested also in litigation, whether or not you're going to be funneled off into a lot of other areas. But another point I want to make that's still applicable to the students is get as much FedJur evidence. Even if you're not going to do litigation, a lot of the advice you're going to be given in the environmental field is to avoid litigation, and you're going to have to understand the fabric of civil procedure, administrative law. I had it from Bonfield. He's probably long gone, but he used to run the library at the end of his career, but he's a genius professor, and we had ad law with him. I can remember using ad law in every single position I ever had. So all of those, I echo what the other panelists have said about that background, but you would not believe how many jobs there are in the environment in the federal government if you want to do something that's really directed at the environment, and large law firms also that represent the other side, from a defense side and advisory side.
Great. I often emphasize that this is a big moment. EPA is hiring, right? There's federal money flowing, especially since August. And so I'm really quite hopeful for those opportunities. We're starting to see these Region 5, I'm hoping 7 pops up soon. Job announcements. Yeah. So I think there will be opportunities. And I often stress, I love that I'm hearing it from all of you, that the jobs you don't think of as necessarily environmental can definitely be environmental. In Oklahoma, it was a bigger metropolitan area. I would often encourage students to apply to the municipal counselor's office because they do all kinds of land use work, which has all, intersections with environmental issues. That's not something that's readily apparent, for example. So I wanted to put that on the table. You just be surprised. I joke I can turn any problem into an environmental problem, but I think it's not too far from the truth, right? And your career paths really illustrate that. So thank you for that. I'm going to move to the next question from the group.
I have a question. To the extent, if we're interested in eventually pursuing advocacy work, when we're trying to gain initial experience through internships or our first years out of law school, to what extent should we consider like the environmental reputation of the companies that we try to get jobs with?
Well, I can, having been in both the private and the public sector, I think I can answer that. If you go to the private sector, at least in a large to a mid-sized firm, you're not going to be able to choose who your clients are, and so I mean that's just a fact of the matter, and especially if you go to a department that's dedicated to environment, you're going to be doing environmental defense. Can I give a short story? First job I ever had was at Squire Sanders and Dempsey because of Watergate. And I was asked by the head of the department, Van Carson, to write this thing up about sulfur dioxide control at steel mills. And I wrote a law review length memo on it, very proud of it, 40, 50 pages. Van Carson came back to my office and said, well, let's go see the president of US Steel and let him know what you found out about sulfur dioxide and scrubbers. And so he had a big smile on his face. I wonder what this is, what's up here. So we were with the president of US Steel, and he said, well, Andy, go ahead and tell him what you found. And I laid it all out for him, very logical. And the conclusion was they had to spend X millions of dollars to put scrubbers on all their facilities so that it wouldn't violate EPA. And he said, well, thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We're not going to do any of that. He said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do nothing right now. We're going to wait till we get a notice of violation from EPA. I'm not violating any client privilege here because this is 40 years ago. So, and he said, by the time they catch up to it, we'll have made enough money that we can buy those scrubbers. So it was a jolt of reality for me because I came out of Iowa very naive, thinking, well, people will know what the law is and they'll want to comply. Well, you know what? Even some federal officials, high ranking, like the chief of engineers, doesn't always like to comply with the environmental laws of the United States. And so that's going to be part of your job, is to convince them why they should do that. And it involves multidisciplinary advice, economics, science. So if I have another tidbit for you, if you haven't had background in chemistry or at least some chemistry, pick it up because it's very useful. So your clients can't, BS you, both either public or private clients cannot pull the wool over your eyes. You'd be amazed at what they'll try to tell you.
I would say from the advocacy side, especially nonprofit advocacy, I think it can cut both ways. So one, there's another attorney who works for IEC right now who was previously counsel for Mid-American. And so, IEC is frequently on the opposite side of issues than Mid-American Energy on the energy side, but he had all that background of how Mid-American operates and what they're, maybe anticipating some of what they would do. And so that was useful background for him to have, even though he was he represented for a long time opposite interests of what IEC is trying to do. So I think there is that, there is that side of it. I also know, we would interview people who had previously worked for the Farm Bureau or things like that. And so we asked a lot of questions in those interviews of like trying to figure out, like, do you agree more with their values or their approach or ours, kind of trying to figure out, what is this going to be a good fit in this organization? Because we were a mission-driven organization and we wanted to make sure we weren't working against people within our own organization. So I think as long as you can explain what you learned, I think still environmental experience is better than not, if that's really where you want to go. And I think ultimately it's a gut choice for you, whether like this organization is, whatever organization you're looking at, is this mission or what they're asking you to do, are you going to be able to like square that with yourself and your own values?
Thank you.
I'll just add briefly, because I think that I totally agree with that advice. So I had accepted a job at a law firm in Des Moines that was going to be doing environmental work. And it was going to be on the industry side. And so that was my full plan, was to get several years of experience. And then when an opportunity in the public sector opened up, I would make that transition. I just was fortunate enough to not have to take that path ultimately. But as I think John's displayed, if you stay in that firm, there's opportunities that open up and you get flexibility for that career. And then the other aspect I would say, just as like a practical matter, at least from my experience, is that you will start to make more money in the private sector. And so it's easy then to all of a sudden find yourself much more accustomed to being at the big law, getting the law firm pay. And then when you try to transition, it might be a little bit harder for you when you say, oh, that's what I'm going to be getting paid now. So I always encourage you, if you're passionate about environmental issues, to just be cognizant of that, because there are a whole lot of competing values that will come into play 4 or 5 years down the line. And so you might be much more accustomed to staying in that that firm career, even though you were initially thinking you would have more of an environmental advocacy path. That's just like a practical aspect of looking at environmental careers. You make a whole lot more money being on the industry side than you do on the nonprofit advocacy side, for the most part.
Yeah, that was something else that happened from, even coming from the university to nonprofit, it was another one of those, this is the salary you're offering. So I think that's something that, definitely to take into account. Like,
Oh, sorry, guys. I just want to make
But
sure.
okay.
Should we click it out or say, okay, what does it say? It says signed out, but sorry, we've got
I
a
can't
message
read
on
it.
the screen. We're just trying to make sure we don't inadvertently, right, sign off or something. X in the top right. There you
I didn't
go.
want this.
Oh my gosh, okay.
It's gone now. Yay.
We're still here. Sorry, everyone.
Get over it. Any more thoughts on that topic? This is a question I get asked all the time. And everything I've heard is consistent, thankfully, with what I've been telling students for a long time. A point one of you made earlier is that a lot of the really big nonprofits don't have the resources to train their litigators, right? So they are, I think Josh Mendelbaum was an example of that, right? They're looking for that experience in the private sector, right? They want you to come to them trained to litigate in federal court. So I often tell students, if you have that private firm opportunity, right, that's your first job, that's your experience, and you will not be, you will be more attractive, right, to NRDC and all the bigger environmental nonprofits that litigate. So just one final point there.
It's also true in the federal government. And even though I was forced to go to the private sector first, I skipped several grades, having just worked for a few years in an environmental practice where I got litigation experience in the 7th and 6th Circuit. And going to EPA, I jumped several steps. It wasn't by plan, it was just by happenstance. So that's very true, that you get experience where you can get it. For me, I was a dedicated, I wanted to be involved in being with the good guys and the good gals. I wanted to punish polluters, all that sort of thing. But like I said at the beginning of mine, you have to be open to opportunities that you do get. I think that's been echoed by everybody. Your first job won't be your last. And if you make the most of it, you work hard at it. The other thing is, somebody mentioned that you don't even have to be practicing environmental law to have a change in your career. One of the biggest breaks in my career was at the EPA. We had a reduction in force, okay, which means we had to get rid of a bunch of people. This is again under Gorsuch. And nobody on the whole 100 and some attorneys we had at EPA wanted to represent the administration in cutting jobs. And because I had some experience in labor law at the law firm, I ended up handling all 11 of the Merit Systems Protection Board and EEO cases, and we won all 11. And because of that, I became very good friends with the regional administrator and got better assignments. So you never know what can come of an opportunity if you do. It's things that you already know. Do your best at anything that they give you, and you don't know what can come of it. And in the end, I ended up practicing on all 7 continents. And I never, sitting where you're sitting today, never could have imagined that. Never could have imagined that. So I owe that to Iowa law.
One final thought on that, right? Judicial clerkships also bump you up the grade scale in the federal government. Highly recommend everyone consider those for your first year or two out of law school. Really a great stepping stone in environmental law. So I think we probably have time for one more question, right? What else do you want to know? I appreciated the shout out for administrative law. Yeah, excellent. Very important. Erin, good.
I had kind of a follow-up question about the working in industry. So far as like if you're doing that and getting experience there, how do you kind of square the, I guess, moral questions of representing maybe points of view that you don't agree with, especially when it comes to environment?
It's a great question, and I don't think you can always square the square. I was never asked to do anything unethical. That's what I can tell you. I was in private practice in the end for 20 years, and I was never asked by a client to do anything unethical. So there's a difference between your moral judgment and what's legal and ethical, and especially in today's environment, I think my advice to you, because you sound like you're very similar to what I was when I was in law school, is try to find a job where you don't have to square the circle. I mean, try to find a job at one of these clerkships, one of these opportunities at EPA, one of these opportunities that show up at justice, and I think you'll find that it's much easier to feel at ease morally in those kind of positions. Although I want to counsel you on this. You will come into cases where politics interfere, especially with I worked for, I think I changed administrations 4 times in my career, in the 3 times in the federal government, and it's jolting, the difference in their approach to environmental issues, very jolting. And so we're lurching back, as was said, there's new opportunities at EPA. But it's a difficult personal thing, but you sound very similar to me. I was able to get through a few years of it without doing anything that I thought was wrong. And he ultimately got back to where I wanted to be on the path.
I'm going to ask Mr. Landy, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say I think in private practice, oftentimes you disagree with the things your client does, sort of generally. And it occasionally, you have strong disagreement with the strategy that they've decided to employ. But I think what Rob was getting at there is, you've got an ethical obligation to make sure that you've told the client everything they need to know about what the consequences of those actions are. And if you've done that and they choose to engage in that strategy, nevertheless, make as much money as they can before they have to install scrubbers, whatever it is. I think you've done everything you need to do as an attorney. I would say rarely are you confronted with a true moral dilemma. Do we dump the waste, above the upstream of the preschool or not? You're not really, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I just don't think those types of stark moral choices come up very often. But if they ever did, in private practice, you're fired. You fire the client, and they got to go find somebody else. If you're in government, I suppose you can quit. But in private practice, you don't have to quit your job. You can fire the client.
I would say too, I think there's a lot of gray area in environmental law and environmental issues. So even when you're, even at IEC, right? Okay, we're the good guys, and we're like on the, there's still a lot of compromising that you have to do, and different environmental issues may be in conflict with each other. So one example from IEC, there was a bill in the legislature that would limit the amount of, basically limit solar installations, and we were fighting that, and the pork producers really like solar for their hog farms. So they were also, and they're a much bigger political player than we are in Iowa politics, right? And so we had to do internally between the water program and the energy program, we had to have a discussion of, okay, can we work with the pork producers here? But pork producers were nervous about working with us. So the water program had to take a step back. So even when you're on the advocacy side, right, you still have to make these kind of calls of, okay, which issues are we prioritizing right now? So I think there's ways to be morally comfortable with things. And there's also ways in which you think it would be more clear and it's not. So I don't know if that's helpful, but eventually it's just a judgment call on your own, and what you value, but a lot of it's messier than you would like it to be.
I would, if I could just add, I think I just agree with what everyone had said. And it's just, I think ultimately it's to yourself and whether or not you still have your moral compass, because I don't know, I always think about how, just at least when I was in law school, there's definitely two tracks for like prosecutors and public defenders. The prosecutors really want to be prosecutors and the public defenders really want to be public defenders. But I always thought that if those public defenders really wanted to implement some of that change, why don't they just become prosecutors? Because then they had prosecutorial discretion and they could make that change. So if you happen to get a job at Chevron or ExxonMobil in their legal department, frankly, I'd rather have you there with your moral compass than somebody who doesn't have a moral compass. So it really comes down to what your values are and how firmly you can keep track of that moral compass. If you find yourself drifting away and practicing in an area you really just don't believe in, or you can't provide that good counsel, then you should probably leave. But there is plenty of opportunity. As I totally agree with what you said, John. It really boils down to it's the client's decision, as we're their legal advocates, their legal counsel. And most of the time it's not, how do I do this really bad thing? It's always a gray area. And so I guess the only thing that I want to stress would just be, just keep track of that moral compass and make sure that you don't lose it wherever you end up after law school.
This is a wonderful note to end on. Really important advice, great questions. I'm glad we could end on that final question. I just want to thank all of you for your time and for being here with us today. Thank you for the work you do, that you have been doing, and for supporting us in this program. I don't be surprised if we call on you again. I hope that's okay, right? You're part of our Healy network now, right? So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time to make up.
Thank you to all of you.
Your stomach? I was like, is that?
I know what was going on, but yeah, it was mine.
They all like. No?
Sure, somebody out there.
You want to?
I do think. Are you gonna sit there?